Hi, everyone. It's Joe Alterman, and I'm so happy you're here today. I'm very excited for this special conversation with the incredible David Amram. Mr. Amram has composed more than 100 symphonic and chamber works, two well acclaimed operas, stage theater and Hollywood scores, too numerous to list, a ballet, and he's performed in jazz and international folk music traditions and festivals from every continent in the world. David will be 95 this November. And I'm not sure if the term Renaissance man existed, 95 years ago, but there's a good chance it was created to describe Mr. Amram. As Dean Berkenkamp described David in his essay, How to Explain David Amram, he wrote, "You could say he collaborated with Langston Hughes, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, Frank Sinatra, Sir James Galway, Elia Kazan, Arthur Miller, Charles Mingus, Ingrid Bergman, Leonard Bernstein, Bob Dylan, Hunter S. Thompson, and Faye Dunaway. But that leaves out 500 other collaborators of similar merit. You could say he composed more than 100 concert hall scores, but you might not know he is a pioneer of world music. You might fail to mention his rapid 30-second notes as he harmonizes with himself on two penny whistles with a rap group. You might have caught a jazz performance where he simultaneously sings freestyle lyrics for 20 minutes at head spinning pace, never missing a rhyme. You might have seen him on a New York stage playing Telegen in the Actors Studio production of Uncle Vanya, or acting with his friends Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Corso in the classic beat film Pull My Daisy. At times, he has been visible to a broad national public, such as in the July 3rd, 1967 Life magazine pictorial, David Amram, Music Making Swinger, featuring photos of Leonard Bernstein and David Amram examining his scores after Bernstein chose him as the New York Philharmonic's first composer in residence. Or when Amram's Holocaust opera, The Final Ingredient, was broadcast on ABC prime time in 1965 and each Passover up through 1969, or when he plays today through his ever present bag of instruments, along with Willie Nelson at Farm Aid concerts. So, as you can see, David Amram is a Renaissance man. There's a lot to talk about, so let's dive in. I'm so happy to talk with you, really. Thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a lot of fun. But I thought it'd be nice to look back a little bit. I know you grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and I was curious what that was like growing up Jewish, and also what it was like growing up with kids. I know I was reading how in 1939, a lot of the students you were in school with, their parents were in the German American Bund.
Right. Well, that was a organization of people that were, you might say, totally disenfranchised as along with everyone else during the Great Depression. And
Hmm.
and they felt because of their German ancestry, and they also had vile names, which I won't read on your program, cast upon them, as every single group that came to the United States unfortunately did, if they didn't change their name to Jack Smith. They
Hmm.
were a whole glossary of terms which we don't use anymore, thank heavens, defaming them. So my father explained to me that because of the whole situation that they were in, they had to find somebody to blame. So
Hmm.
the only people that they could blame in our little school in Southampton, the public school, was either African American kids or the Jewish American kids, which was my sister and myself. And she couldn't stand it, so she finally didn't go there anymore. And I had to learn how to defend myself and fight and all that stuff. But my father explained to me that I had to understand why those other children behaved that way. And it wasn't because there was anything that was wrong with me or anything that was wrong with them. It was a situation of economic depression and the fact that most of the kids and their families were suffering and they had no recourse to do anything except to hate somebody else and try to cast the blame. That's an old story that doesn't just apply to Jewish people, but to all people. When you study history a little bit, almost every group that came over here were oppressed from whence they came, and they came here for the ideals that we have in America of democracy and justice and freedom for all. And we've gradually been working towards that. And now the people who who built the Statue of Liberty have already indicated they'd like to buy it back. I don't think we'll come to that. I think just in terms of what's happened recently, that reason will prevail, and that the current administration is no different than it was during the Depression when they had Father Coughlin, whom I hope your readers don't remember anymore. And they had Senator Bilbo, who wrote some horrible open letters using vile names towards one of his Italian American constituents. And later on, people like Senator McCarthy that terrorized everybody. And the wonderful thing that seems to be happening is that I guess you say the Democratic Party has woken up to the fact that we can't just sit here any more than Jewish people are just supposed to lie down and say we're sorry and be put in gas chambers. The idea that we're supposed to passively watch our liberty that we still have go down the drain is being questioned and challenged. And I really have hopes that we're going to overcome this particular situation. And I don't want to cast bad aspersions on anybody, but I honestly believe that the new booker and talent scout for the Kennedy Center, when he is deposited in the landfill, what I call the landfill of the eminently, deservedly forgettable, will be an asterisk in history and forgotten about. And I lived in DC for 10 years, as you know, and there's a lot of nice buildings with empty rooms, and all you need is some good artists to come in there, and they'll turn any place into a temple of the arts, whether it's a nice room that's free with a piano in it, or it was what we knew as the Chitlin circuit when our African-American brothers and sisters played in these crappy places, not because they were masochists or that's because what they deserved, but because that's the only place that they could play the music that they wished to. Some of us were blessed to be part of that, which you have been, and I am now, and go through that and then understand the beauty that's there and the fact that people who presumably have no value in our society can turn any little room into the temple of the arts. So I feel bad about the Kennedy Center. I conducted the National Symphony there, which is great. I played folk and jazz festivals. They have wonderful upholstery. However, if the person who's now become that fires everybody takes it over and wants to be the talent scout, well, I wish him and all the poor people that he gets the very best, but we can play and create music somewhere else, and we'll do that and have been doing that, and we'll continue to do that as long as there's any civilization left.
That's great. Yes, yes, we will. Well, you mentioned how you lived in DC for a little, and I know you went from DC to Pennsylvania, and what I know before we got on this chat, you were mentioning something about your father wanting to live on a farm. I was just curious if you
Oh no,
could share that.
he and his father, uh, who was a Zionist, and his second wife lived in Palestine before there was a state of Israel, and
Mm,
loved Israel. And my grandfather wrote wonderful books about that. And his first wife wrote poetry, Beulah Barlowski,
mm.
from Cameron, North Carolina. And
Hey.
and I learned the little bit that I know about our Jewish traditions from my father in our farmhouse. We had Friday night services there. And then in 1942, he sold the farm after he had a degree in agronomy and was a full-time farmer with my uncle David. So they just about went broke after years and went to law school and ended up teaching and writing books. But he continued farming almost as if we had our own little kibbutz. And it was a wonderful chance to grow up on a farm and mow the lawn next door and get educated by all those off-work farmers. And
Mm,
when we moved from there to Washington, D.C. in 1942, we lived in what was then called a checkerboard neighborhood, because
mm,
as the people from who read your wonderful magazine probably know, or their parents can remind them, Washington, D.C. was part of the South. And in the South, officially legislated was the fact that black and white people couldn't hang out with each other, supposedly. and had to live and go to separate schools. And we lived in a neighborhood where black and white folks were together. And we
Mm,
got together in spite of all of that, not as a select group of activists, just as human beings to play. And I learned a lot of great music and met a lot of wonderful people, many of whom are still my friends as a result of living in that situation. And because of my great great grandfather coming from Savannah and my other relatives still living there, I also
mm,
those southern roots, which I also treasure. So when I found the Eastern Seaboard establishment quality lit of where I was the party piano player for 20 years, so I could raise my IQ and meet nice young women that had a shower, I had a wonderful time. But I noticed that when all the writers from William Styron on down who came from the South would go there, they would be getting generally, until Styron got that famous, the snub treatment because they were south of New Jersey. So
mm,
maybe understand that I suppose everyone feels the need to dump on someone else. And since
mm.
Eastern Seaboard established a literary crowd had no one to dump on, they they chose
Mhm.
they chose Southerners as being representative of everything that was wrong. And I said, well, if you take away Eudora Welty and Langston Hughes and Willie Morris and Truman Capote and Faulkner, what do we have intellectually in this country? Not to mention the
Mm,
wonderful composers like Carlisle Floyd, who wrote the great opera Susanna, but he refused to come to New York and live and teach at Juilliard or anywhere. He stayed and taught in the South and stayed in Louisiana because he loved it there. And
mm,
there's so many great artists and great people that come from the South, and it's a whole thing that enriches our culture, just as Jewish people have enriched every culture we've been part of. And when you look
mm,
at it that way, then you see a pattern of, and let's have an enemy, let's have a hatred. When you don't hate anybody, then you can appreciate everybody. And you start off by not hating yourself and your relatives,
mm.
your family. And if your grandmother cooked matzo ball soup in a special way, instead of saying, I must tone down my ethnicity to become assimilated into the great melting pot, you just end up as another confused person with no sense of heritage and no sense of
Mm,
belonging to anything.
mm.
Therefore, you're a menace to society, even if you read Moment Magazine, because you you find that there's a lot of information that you don't know about yourself. And as James Baldwin so elegantly mentioned in one of his great books, we know everything about you, referring to folks of the Caucasian persuasion. We know everything about you, but you know nothing about us.
Mm,
So when you go all the way back to the good old Bible, the story of Adam and Eve, aside from the fact that the rents have been too high ever since they left the Garden of Eden, they indicated that men and women always have had a struggle getting along together because we don't really know that much about one another. And the women
mm,
know everything about men, and we know very little about women and how they feel. So life is an education. And one of the best ways to get an education is to hang out with folks that know more than you do. And because
mm,
about that, all the stuff you play and the great jazz playing that you do, you weren't born knowing how to do that, but you
mm,
learned it and felt it and were part of it. And people that showed you stuff showed you with that spirit of generosity. And then when you really get to talk to them, you find out that that's how they learned.
mm.
I have 8 honorary doctorates, but my knowledge that I have comes from being a lifetime student in the University of Hangoutology, which means
I love it.
that means to be with those who know more than you do. And if you learn to say please several times, different languages, and thank you very much. And then you say, please, could you show me that again a little slower? And
Mm,
then, please, uh, could you explain the tempos? Where is the one? And let's
mm,
build around that one. And then, if you find that out, to find whether you're supposed to be a little behind the beat of one like we are in gospel music and so much music, or a little ahead of the beat the way they are in bluegrass music and Vivaldi. And you're dealing with real fundamental stuff that comes from a whole cultural feeling. So you try to learn then the style of how to play, and that takes about 35 years. But then you're not impersonating or stealing someone's stuff. You're honoring it. A big
Mm,
difference. And that goes, I think the writers certainly do that too.
mm. Well, that brings to mind like to me, how I've always been curious how you relate to genre because you play so many different kinds of music, and but you also have your personality is in all of those music. So I was just curious, do you see it all as different genres of music, or do
Oh,
you?
you know it. It's just
Yeah.
like Joe, it's like different languages.
Mm,
And you
hmm
try to, and then once you learn French, for example, with my mother
mm.
translated, and I flunked it every year. So I have to study grammar, the subjonctif and all that to make sure that's the right thing. Et on a essayé à parler avec un accent impeccable comme les gens à l'école de Lyon parlent français parfaitement, sans erreur. Then you go to French Canada,
Wow.
and les gens parlent français avec un accent canadien, c'est totalement différentes choses différentes. It's, but that's beautiful too. It's just a
Mm,
different way of speaking the same language. And it's not necessarily a dialect. Sometimes it's just a different style, and you get
hmm
music as you know. Even I shouldn't say even, especially playing jazz, and you hear the old time players, and then you hear harmonically and rhythmically what the players have developed up until today, it keeps changing, but it
mm,
all goes back to that New Orleans second line funk, beautiful neighborhood, soulful feeling of being together and celebrating somehow, and
mm,
welcoming anybody that wants to join in,
mm,
and having people in the neighborhood groups play their whole life and share it with their kids and invite
mm,
anybody and everybody to become part of that.
mm.
And that's a wonderful thing. Dizzy Gillespie explained part of that to me when we went as embajadores de ben voluntad, that means goodwill ambassadors, to Havana, Cuba. And Castro's sister was picketing it, so she was one of those who didn't feel that way that we should. And
Huh.
President Carter wanted to have some kind of a détente uh, politically that would at least say, well, we can send some musicians down to spread some good feelings and just show we have some interest besides bombing them. And he didn't choose a group of people who were members of the American Communist Party, God bless him, except a lot of those people have what Tom Wolfe described, not the old writer, but the younger one, uh,
Mm.
with the white suit, great Southern writer,
Yeah.
as extreme left-wing sympathies with an extreme right-wing lifestyle. They just want
Mm,
us to go down as musicians that love music 90 miles away to play. And if
mm,
that country was sort of a dictatorship, so were all the other countries in Central America and around the world that we supported that were worse. But they didn't.
mm,
They were communists. They were just they always had a different title. So uh, when we were on the boat, he explained to me that the Empire Brass Band came down to serenade us.
mm.
Right, we were standing on top of this ship about to go to Cuba, and uh, the captain said, "If you guys go down there and play with them," they said, "Come on, Dizzy, and your French horn player, come on down here and play with us." Well, the captain said, "They're not going to stop us from leaving on time. We'll leave without you." Said Dizzy. Dizzy said, "Don't worry, man. They ain't leaving without me." So we went down and sat in with the band and played for an hour. And it was so much fun because he explained to me that neighborly, welcoming thing was something
Mm,
that's part of a kind of a cultural thing in New Orleans called the philosophy of the gumbo. I said,
mm,
I said, what's that? He said, well, he said, everybody in this country came from someplace else. So we bring some of our heritage to the table and we put it into that big gumbo pot. which is the whole country. And we put in the most precious ingredients. When we partake from that pot, all of us are re-nourished by the goodness that's in that pot. And he said, if you live here long enough, you become New Orleanized, which means you've partaken of all the beautiful things that are here.
Wow.
And that's not assimilation, and it's not a melting pot. In Canada,
Mm.
they call it a mosaic, which means if you say you want to become a Canadian citizen, you have to pledge allegiance to the Queen, but because it's still part of the Commonwealth. However, you're supposed to bring from whence you came into the mainstream, and everybody can partake of that knowledge and heritage and enrich Canada's culture and enrich and make being a Canadian a more universal person and still have that
Mm.
Canadian thing or things, whatever that is. Because you go to Canada, there's all different feelings in the different provinces, a huge country. And it's something to think about. And Dizzy was the person that told me about that.
Wow.
So I
That is
quoted
so
that
special.
with Moment Magazine's one of his founders, Eli Wiesel, who said,
Mm.
we must learn to forgive, but never to forget.
Mm.
And he was referring also to the fact that we have to know where we came from and what we went through and are going through so that it won't happen again. So
Mm.
I don't, I feel sorry for Holocaust deniers or people who deny that we had slavery or that we had cheated the American Indians by having 160 treaties which we haven't signed, but also by acknowledging that to look at the right things that we've done anyway.
Mm.
So, and forgive those who created that, because as they say, as we would say from the South, they was brought up wrong. I should
Well,
say they was brung up wrong. You might say,
that's it.
or
Well,
they was brang up wrong.
even better.
And,
Well,
and that's all beautiful too. And the antipathy that Eastern intellectuals have against anybody from the South is laughable, except because it's so stupid, except that people who actually believe that don't realize that they're fitting right in to the same victimizing hatred of addressing 40 million people that they never met personally. And then one
mm,
thing about the Jewish religion, which most of us don't know until, unless we're lucky enough to have somebody who's really checked out the Torah, pick out a few selections to read, that we're supposed to be thinking, questioning, and not only giving tzedekah, the gift, not handing out paper towels, rolls of paper towels, throwing it to the Israelis of Puerto Rico, as our great leader did a long time ago, but rather spirit of generosity, the empty chair at the Passover service for the uninvited guest, a spirit
mm,
of generosity and caring and sharing. And I think for us, we can forget about that because we can become so imbued with the stereotypes against us that we forget all about the beauty part and
mm.
wonderful part.
Wow. Well, speaking of never forgetting, I'm so curious what it was like being stationed in Germany in 1952, shortly after the end of World War II.
Well, I got there in, I think it was January. We landed on the boat at the port of Bremerhaven. And I remember thinking, boy, I'm in a country of where great intellectuals, everybody's got a briefcase. So
Mm.
they must have some books inside. I didn't realize that they carried the sandwiches. They carried the sandwiches in the briefcases. The guys who were back, the soldier, we were playing, I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now as the
Mm.
land. Actually, they throw cigarette butts and empty bottles at us because they didn't want to hear, they were leaving their homes to come to a strange country. Then we were sent to Saarbrücken. And then because I played the French horn, but I was also a history major, I had to go all the way down to where Dachau was. which is where
Mm,
the band camp was. So I knew if I
mm,
played a scale, I'd get in the band because there were no, in 1950, January of 53, there was not a plethora of French horn players. And so, but while I had to wait around to take my big audition to see if I needed to go to band school, I
mm.
visited the remains of what used to be the place where people were cooked in ovens, including some of my relatives, and it was kind of
Mm.
horrible. And ended up, we were sleeping in the SS barracks.
Oh my
What
gosh.
used to be the SS barracks, and they didn't, they changed the building. I remember that. I didn't sleep very well, um,
Mm,
and neither did any of the people who were murdered there. So
mm.
finally, I took my audition. Bomb, 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 bomb. All right, Bremerhaven, we need a French horn player. That was the end of my audition. They one octave scale. Most of the people who came to the band school didn't play an instrument, but they didn't want to go in the infantry, so they think, well, I'll go into band school. And
Mm.
I owned a clarinet in the third grade and learned how to. So uh, the U.S. government spent all that money sending me all over Germany to end up where I had landed 12 days prior to that. Fortunately, by making a lot of desperation phone calls, I was able to get into something called the Seventh Army Symphony, which was like heaven compared to having to go out in field maneuvers, and 10,000 times better than going to Korea and being killed. So
Mm.
I was spent the rest of the time in the Seventh Army Symphony and had such a good time playing with all these wonderful jazz musicians from Germany, most of whom were incarcerated and some of them sent off to Russia or
Mm.
front lines because of Moore's cannon fodder, because they were sympathetic to what Adolf Hitler didn't like. And at the same time, meeting these guys who were playing, who was terrific playing, but felt like lost souls, because when they came to the PXs and met American soldiers, they saw the racism we had here that they thought we didn't have anymore. And
Mm.
and I so I got a feeling about them, and I also realized you can't feel every German person was a Nazi any more than they could feel that every American white person is a racist, or
Mm.
feel any blanket disdain or disrespect for any person. You have to make a soul to soul connection with every person that you meet.
Mm.
And hardest of all, you have to understand that that's the way they feel, and that's the way they were
Mm.
brought up. And our job is not to argue incessantly, except with other Jewish people, because we're experts at arguing, but try to hear and understand how they feel.
Mm.
If it seems like it's hopeless, then
Mm.
well, in that case, I better not act that way myself, because it ain't cool to be on the
Mm.
receiving end. But
Mm.
when we talked about all the great jazz players you were with, uh, you already know that, and you can
Mm.
play great yourself, and as well as writing and everything else. And I'm sure it's because you have an open mind, and people could read what you're like and say, "Hey, I'm going to show that guy something." Whereas you can't learn in the university hangoutology anything if you go in with the idea that you're better or that you know everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it forces you to act in humbly, or at least to pretend to be humble enough,
Mm.
something to act basically like a decent, civilized person.
Yeah,
And
that's
I think
that's fair.
everybody is a mensch until they're told you're not going to get anywhere that way, or being too nice. Or when poor Jack Kerouac, after being ignored till he was 35 years old, suddenly becoming a world famous figure overnight, we went to some big party. Someone came up to me and said, "If that guy's so great, how come he's talking to me?" I said,
What?
"Wow." But then I knew so many people, as we all did, that not just jazz musicians, but people in general who were very
Mm.
accomplished, but they were so nice.
Mm.
And I met enough people like that, so that when I got sort of seen the narcissistic monster fans of Adolf Hitler, I realized Well, that's a drag because
Mm.
they make, they make you feel terrible. Usually the children grow up a total mess. They don't have any old friends. And then when they lose their position of so-called power, which can happen in a flash,
Yeah.
suddenly they don't have anything.
Mm. Wow. Well, how does it? I mean, obviously, a lot of this is controlled by how you approach it in your mind. But I think, how does it feel being a Jew in 2024? How does that compare to living as a Jew any other time in your life?
I think it's the same as it's been for over 5,000 years. We're gonna, we somehow have that instinctive, primal, hereditary thing
Mm.
just so beautiful, that pumpernickel in the DNA, as I referred to it to one of my severe critics, who said, "You're obviously a white bread Jew." And I said, I have still have pumpernickel in my DNA, some kind of identity, some kind of a calling, some kind of a feeling. And when I would lived on the Lower East Side, and I was right next to an old Orthodox synagogue, and I heard the people singing. And then
Mm.
when I was in Germany, and they had the five remaining Jewish people in Frankfurt that were left that had somehow gone back to the old temple, which is bombed out, but and I heard them singing. Somehow I was touched. It touched
Mm.
something deep inside me. And when I heard the great Irish singers singing and singing some of those, and Scottish singers singing some of those old melodies, and when
Mm.
Middle Eastern singers, when I went to the Middle East and I heard the muezzins, man, there's
Mm.
just something about that. I said, "Whoa, boy, that took me way back." And
Mm.
when I played in Egypt, I met the few people in the Jewish community. I said, "It's so fantastic. We have some Amrams there that left," and they said, "We never left." And then I realized that a lot of that beautiful Arabic music, somehow that comes in all of our klezmer music and all the music that we've
Mm.
done, and that we all are somehow cousins and related to each other. And there's a community of the soul. I don't even
Mm.
understand it, and I think it's inexplicable, is what they call the great unknown.
Mm.
And I was remember when I was in the Army, someone said, man, I'm American Indian. He said, not, and they didn't call themselves Native Americans. And they said, I was walking out in Arizona and I saw a guy down the highway way. I said, boy, that's a skin. That was their nickname. They called one for Redskin back in those days.
Mm.
He said, but that's a skin. Sure enough, it was another American Indian person walking in a different direction where Indians weren't walking around that much off the reservation. And he said it was just such a great feeling to see
Mm.
another Indian. There was some kind of connection that he had. And I think there's a connection, a community connection between all of us, and somehow a heritage that we don't understand. And when people have been in this country or any country where you can come here and do better than your parents or grandparents did, we feel a necessity to abandon all of that.
Mm.
Then the grandchildren come back and start studying again. And a lot of them even move into the old neighborhoods. That doesn't mean that we have to go back to horse and buggy days, or we all have to work behind a push cart, or all have to starve to death. So
Mm.
I'm not advocating poverty because it's a drag, but rather the fact that there's some kind of ancestral thing that everybody has. And if you lose that, even the fact that you could have that feeling that you don't understand, you're missing
Mm.
out on everything. And conversely, I really believe that all people of the Jewish faith should somehow find a way to realize that we're all part of that same community, tribe, whatever you want to call it. So therefore, I refuse to accept the intellectual disdain that many people have for Orthodox Jewry or the
Mm.
Hasidic Jewry or people that who have adopted the Jewish faith, like Willie the Lion Smith, who some
Mm.
a recording of, or Jimmy Cagney when he's speaking in Yiddish,
Wild.
all people that aren't even Jewish that somehow are affected by us. It's the same thing that we feel when we play music of other cultures that we're not born into, that we respect and love, that touches us.
Mm,
And I think it's a very part of it, big part of the Jewish religion and ethics to be interested in many things,
hmm.
not not giving the impression you're good at all of them, but at least be interested.
Yeah.
And the ones that you feel the most, that means that's for you to do, and you should
Mm.
accept it and respect it.
Wow. Well, you talking about growing up, being in the Lower East Side and hearing these sounds, it reminded me of a quote, which was from Ornette Coleman. He said, I was once in Chicago about 20 some years ago, and a young man said, I'd like you to come by so I can play something for you. So I went down to his basement and he put on Cantor Joseph Rosenblatt, and I
Oh,
started crying like a baby. The record he had was crying, singing, and praying all in the same breath.
yeah.
I said, wait a minute, you can't find those notes. Those are not notes. They don't exist. So I was curious, you mentioned in one of your emails to me about how you thought Rabbi Akiva would have made a good jazz fan. So I'm just curious why you think there's such a simpatico or connection between jazz and Judaism.
Well, I think that it gives us a respect, first of all, for some of the beautiful old time singing, the
Mm,
cantillations, the singing, the prayers, and the feeling that music is a way of worship.
mm,
Temple that I've joined, now I'm not exactly what you call a joiner, but I couldn't resist this one. The rabbi is, for, didn't really adopt the idea of becoming a rabbi till she was 41. She
mm,
studied Manhattan School of Music, and she studied with the Chabad, which is the Lubavitchers, that were the Orthodox branch of the Hasidic Jews, but instead of becoming a Lubavitcher rabbi, she became a Reformed rabbi. So
mm,
when I went there and I heard her sing, and she has a clarinet player that sounds like Giora Feidman, the great klezmer
mm.
clarinet player. He played with the Brooklyn Philharmonic and played the bass clarinet solo. Somebody came up in the orchestra and said, Mr. Feidman, I'm Jewish, but I was always told, that klezmer music is a vulgar mis misapprehension of what a classical player is he was supposed to know about. He said, I
Mm.
wish I could do that. And he said, everybody is a klezmer. And he played with the Israel Philharmonic, so he knew how to take the dose off the paper, but he could really play. But
Wow.
he felt, and Andy Statman, when I first met him, was just playing
Mm,
wonderful. He's on an old record I made in 1971. He and
mm,
Romberg played, he was playing the mandolin, incredible. He became a great klezmer clarinetist, and they're different languages of the same music. And
mhm,
I think one of my pieces, Shirei Neshama, Songs of the Soul,
mm,
I wrote a symphony. First was based on the this pe people who came from Ethiopia who had the Jewish faith thousands of years ago. They were referred
mm,
to then as Palashas, and they don't use that term anymore. That's now become a bad term. But they were from that from that old culture. The second movement, I were things of my own that I made based on the idea of the nigun, which I wrote myself, based on Central European cantorial music and songs. And the third, I used lechadodi that I learned from
mm,
Avram Pengas, a wonderful Israeli musician I've known 50 years, that was
mm,
brought over by the people from Yemen when they came on what they called the magic carpet, because they'd never been in an airplane, most of them. And there they were flying to this strange place called Israel. So they just
mm.
get wiped off the face of the map, and brought some of that music with them. And my dad's side was Sephardic, so I appreciated both Sephardic and Ashkenazi cultures and loved them both. And
Mm.
don't know nearly as much as I wish I did know about either of them. But I'm studying away. As you see, I have my little thing here, a,
Yeah,
a senior yeshiva bucher trying, because
man.
my grandfather taught me Hebrew, but he was so terrifying. He was a great man, But and also he's kind of impatient, and I was kind of a nutcase kid. So he gave me a writer's block so that when my kids all went to Hebrew school, I had to try to study with them to learn some of the fundamentals. But
Wow.
it's something that I think resonates in you somehow. And for
Hmm.
people who have that driven out of them so that they can be real Americans, you can be a real American and speak many languages and love
Mm,
many kinds of music. And then you go to a city like New Orleans or New York City, especially go to
mm,
Queens where 100 languages are spoken. And
yeah.
it's just hang out on the street. It's like the ultimate university of hangoutology. Everybody
Mhm.
there knows something that you don't. And and
Mm,
and that's what makes the world such a wonderful place. It's like Jacob's idea of the coat of many colors.
mm,
But that doesn't
beautiful.
mean that they're all the same.
Mm,
You just homogenize and squish them into one package if you're trying to franchise or retail something of spiritual value. All that
mm,
comes from it's free. You just got to study it. And that's what
mm.
I have so much respect for those people that sit in temple all day studying the Torah and they can put their pin through it at the end and tell
Oh
you
yeah.
which page on page 242 your pin has hit a certain prayer because they know that stuff. I always say that's our gyroscope. So
Mm,
I have enormous respect for people who are really devoted in that way because they're keeping it together for all of us that might stray or go about
mm,
being out in the world. But we have something to come back to because it's still here.
mm. Man, I love that. Wow. Well, yeah, I was reading about how you made borscht for Charlie Parker one time, and y'all discussed race relations. And I was just curious if in that conversation, or if in these conversations with Black musicians where you talk about things like this, if the Jewish thing would ever come up, and if you might be able to share a little bit about your Let Us Remember piece that you co-wrote with Langston
Oh, sure.
Hughes.
Well, that I wrote with Langston Hughes, and when we went, it was the United Hebrew Congregations of America had this enormous concert at the San Francisco Opera House with the Oakland Symphony
Mm,
and a huge chorus and an orchestra. And he wrote the text, but he based it largely on the Yiskar and also on the current events that were happening in Selma and in the South at that time. And we
mm,
went to meet the head of one of the people who was the cultural in charge of the cultural activities. He said, "Well, Mr. Hughes, I'm not sure if you understand exactly what this event is about." He said, "The Jewish tradition is almost inexplicable and it's a very abstract, and there's a certain," he kept going on and on and on, like, "You're never going to get this." Because and Langston sat there very quietly, said, "I think I understand, Rabbi, exactly what you're speaking about because my grandfather was Jewish."
whoa.
And the gentleman from the United Hebrew Congregations of America stopped in his tracks and said, "Oh," and ended the conversation because Langston, like most African American people, came from a background where there many people married many other people
Mm,
of different races, different colors, etc. And
mhm,
and Langston was amazing, just a wonderful person. He said one of the great things when I wrote him a letter about Jack Kerouac and what a difficult time he was having when they played Let Us Remember at the Opera House, and I mentioned Neil Cassidy and Allen Ginsberg and all these other people I bumped into, and Freddie,
mm,
great jazz piano player, all were at this little place I just wandered into, and they all came to the concert. Gregory Corson
mm.
came all dressed up in a suit
Wow.
this time, and he said to me, wearing those tails, he said, "You look like a penguin." Say, dress, no, he had on a some kind of a homemade flowery shirt and a necktie made out of a bandana. Everybody got dressed up for the occasion at the San Francisco Opera House, but it was amazing, to see that piece being done.
Mm.
And at the same time, when I wrote Langston about that, he said, and in my book, Upbeat Collaborator Kerouac, he said, tell Jack I have the same problems that he has, considering now to be a one-hit wonder, or because I'm writing for the New York Post, as if that were a character defect. And I have a character called Semple, who's the man on the street describing how he felt, which is really a fount of knowledge for all of us. But people reading that say, well, he must have really slipped to be writing something so simplistic.
Mm.
He said, tell Jack Kerouac never to be an Uncle Tom for the white literary establishment.
Wow.
I said, wow. And of course,
Whoa.
this was 1965. Now, here we are, and quite a few weeks later, 60 years, something like that. Yeah, 60 years later, that's
Wow.
changed the opinion of Jack Kerouac as not the king of the beats, but rather a extraordinary writer who doesn't need any label.
Mm.
And the gravy train that he created for a lot of mediocre people, they all jumped off of after he wasn't fashionable anymore, no longer exists. But his books speak for themselves. And
Mm.
and Langston is now appreciated not as a washed up writer of the Harlem Renaissance, which he told me they never called it during that time, but someone
Wow.
who's just an extraordinary writer. And
Mm.
I think that we have a tendency in the pure culture, if there is such a thing, to have people build up and then torn down, and that seems to be part of the part of our way of doing things, and it's
Mm.
really wasteful.
Oh yeah. Wow. Well, when you were with Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, or any of these guys, would y'all ever talk about the Jewish thing? Were they curious about it, or I don't?
Well, they you know, when I first met Dizzy in '51, he came to my basement apartment and crashed out with his whole band. And he had one
Wow.
one bed, a few chairs, and a sofa, and I was sat on the floor. He sat in a chair. Everybody else was asleep. They played in Baltimore, and we jammed a little at my place. And then
Mm.
he said, "You have to understand this." He said, "As a person in exile, what they call in the grade school books, the wandering Jew," he said,
Mm.
you are a nomadic person who's lived in many, in terms of your heritage, many countries, many places in the world.
Mm.
And he said, this is your home now. But he said, you have to understand all the other people who've also been wandering, lived in different places, and brought all of those experiences with them. And he said, African
Mm.
American people have been all over and left some of their culture, the rhythms, the way of being in there where they were, and brought that plus what they learned in those other places to the next country,
Mm.
and finally came here. So they were doing much more than just what's been accepted by ethno-funkologists who say they just
No fun.
brought the wah-wah-co rhythm with them to to Cuba. Actually, a lot of different places were responsible for some of those forms of music coming to the Caribbean, all the Caribbean,
Mm.
and part of our of the New Haitian and New Orleans experiences, which we're just beginning to study.
Mm.
And the same thing in Jewish music, that it's never was written down, but it was also a language that changed as it went from country to country. So
Mhm.
you hear Yusla Rosenblatt, and some of what he's doing, that the klechet, the tear in the voice, is like the sound that the Muzins have when they sing their cantillations. It's different, but as simple as
Mm.
comes from that same mysterious root. And I think a part of it is any old music that's still played, even though it keeps changing, still the essence of it is there because it's just so good,
Mm.
people can't let go of it. And
Mm.
creates a certain feeling, and musicians somehow keep that alive, and it keeps until it becomes traditional. but
Mm.
it comes from a real beautiful, honest place. And
Mm.
it will always have that effect. Sir James Galway, when he plays Mozart, I wrote a flute concerto for him. The end of every concert, after he plays Mozart and all of that, he takes a penny whistle out of his vest pocket and plays Danny Boy and
Mm.
it's so beautiful,
Mm.
so touching. And he said, I'm celebrating our Irish heritage wherever I play, whatever I do. And that song makes me feel close to God.
Wow.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And he can really play. And he doesn't need to do that. He does that because
Wow.
that's something he feels it's important for people to see. He's not only was the premier,
Mm.
Ron Powell were the two, and Julius Baker, I guess, were the three guys that were the best known flute players in the world.
Mm.
And he wanted the world to know where he came from.
Wow.
Pretty,
Man,
pretty interesting.
that
And,
is. Oh.
when I was with Dizzy and I was going down south
Mm.
again to see my family in Savannah, and Dizzy was with a group of guys, and he took down his glasses, out of those glass horn rims. He put them down where he said, "Where are you going now?" Because I played with him at the Village Gate. I said, "Well, Diz, I'm going down to Birmingham. I'm going to Macon, Georgia, and Savannah."
Mm.
He said, "Oh yeah." He said, "You tell us what it's like when you get back." Everybody sat in the room like quiet. So
Mm.
came back and he took down his glasses, and the same guys were in this band were there. He, "How was it, Dave?" I said,
Mm.
"That was fantastic. I went to the black college and I went to the white college and the Jewish community center and the church chorus, and then had a big jam session. And the guy who owned a department store took his trumpet out of the closet. We just played two chords all for 14 hours so everybody could
Mm.
figure out what." I said, "It was wonderful." And everybody in the room smiled
Wow.
because they all had Southern roots that they might have escaped from the South because of the
Mm.
social conditions. Uh, but they didn't. They still had a feeling for that place,
Mm.
and then they said, "Well, Dave, I don't want to use a bad word, but it was okay to say it on the pro." Okay, he, I,
It's okay.
okay. He said, "Let's hear some of your Jewish shit." So I played "Oh Say Shalom" on the.
Really?
I had my little penny whistle with me and another song, and they said, "Oh," and I saw the same man. He's got he digs his own culture he was born into. Maybe he can
Mm.
appreciate what we're doing because we got something too, rather
Mm.
than. And also the fact that I didn't say I loved it, the people were nice, which I did say, rather than those oppressed fascists weren't like me who loves oppressed people, but rather they were just awful as opposed to me because I'm such a groovy liberal guy. They're so used to
Mm.
BS that it's sickening, the patronizing
Mm.
stuff, you know. And I always had wondered how come guys like that came here, went through so much hell, played in the crappiest circumstances, and made that magnificent music. How could they
Mm.
forgive? And they did the same thing as Eli Wiesel said. It's,
Mm.
we have to learn to forgive, but never to forget.
Wow.
And that's
That's
not a bad thing. That means understanding history, learning history. So, and I think we managed to do that for 5,000 years, or there wouldn't be any Jewish people. There would have been here. It's an extraordinary mitzvah, which means gift
Mm.
that we're born into. We didn't say, "I'm going to choose my parents to be Hare Krishnas or Jewish or Catholic."
Mm.
And in this country, you could be anything you want every 5 minutes and change your name, and
Mm.
and that's good too. There's a lot to be said for our laissez-faire. You can, but to
Mm.
have a gift of a heritage and throw that all away because you're told it's not chic is wrong.
Mm.
Conversely, it's wrong if Jewish people think everybody that's not Jewish is a numbskull. That's
Mm.
just as bad. Just to
Yeah.
be part of something beautiful, and so is everybody else, whether they know it or not.
I love that. Man. Well,
I
I
just
know,
thought of it.
oh, that's well, you should we'll save it. It's good. Well, I know not everyone has musical talent or really, gets into music, but I feel that music is just so important. I was just curious, why should people, in your opinion, who don't have musical talent learn about music or learn music?
You know, Joe, I think about that every day, and every time I go to
Really?
school, like a New England Conservatory gave me my eighth honorary doctorate. I said, "Wow!" And that's actually people that know how to read and write it down, read it off the page. They classical studies. But thanks
Mm,
to Gunther Schuller and Hank Osmetsky, who's there, and Rand Blake, and
mm,
all the monster musicians that teach there, they learn a lot of different kinds of music. They were
mm,
so enthusiastic because that when they gave me the doctorate, I sat through the graduation. So 150 freshman students,
mm,
they were fresh. They were going to be freshmen if they went on. They were graduates,
mm.
most of them 21 years old,
Uh,
and not with that look on their face like, I know this is hopeless, and but our rotten country doesn't support the arts, blah, blah, whine, whine, blame, blame. They were enthusiastic
mm,
and they played their cans off and
mm,
wrote terrific music, whatever it is they were doing. I said, boy. So I just said, let me just say one thing to you guys. When you're told it's an overcrowded field, there's no career possibilities, it's only 3% of the market,
mm,
it's fine. But just respond to people. There are never too many sunsets, never
mm,
enough beauty. And the fact that you're here and you can do something so well and you love your job when you get
mm,
one, and you put up with your day job so that you can continue your other job and love of life devotion to music. I said, you
mm,
end up having a better life because you have more friends, older friends. You'll be still closer to your family and all your relatives that no one else might speak to. And
mm,
you'll have nicer kids and more fun
mm,
than you will in any other thing, unless you're with
mm,
people who love what they're doing. And the magic word, try to do a good job and better than is expected. So by default, all us no goodniks who are told I want to be in music so I could meet a lot of women and sleep late and not get a job, that's fine for people to dismiss our value on those stupid terms. But
mhm,
I think they don't realize that by default, we've become role models for people who love our work and
mhm,
do better than is expected and are gracious to other people in the
mm,
process and encourage other people who want to do the same thing.
mm,
When I was in Greece in the army on a furlough, I said, boy, I, I'd love to be an anthropologist. So I went to a site, man, they were digging up these precious things. I spoke to the person. He said, there's no future in this work. He gave me a half-hour lecture on why it was a waste of time. I should never bother to do it. He talked me out of even thinking about it. I'm mentioning it now, so I guess I have thought about it. But I remember I said, he managed to completely bum me out of doing it. Now, that's not his fault.
mm,
He was just expressing his own despair at his non-career. I guess what he assumed was a waste of time, that he should have been doing something
mm,
else. But I said, man, part of our gig is to make others feel they can be creative. They've got to
mm,
tell if they like what we did, they can do something better. And if you can
mm,
make someone feel good about that, and feel good about themselves, then if you foster creativity in others, then you're really doing something valuable.
mm.
Just like the
Oh, that's
no, the wonderful
yeah,
Les McCann.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you described so beautifully to be in our conversations, and that could
Mm.
be a whole program. I should interview you about that.
We could do it
All
again.
the things that he told you. One of the great stories that you wrote, I'd just like to share with your
Yeah.
readers, was when Oscar Peterson came to hear him. He said he got scared. He's played with the king of spectacular technique beyond belief. And he said, Oscar, I'm nervous. I'm nervous playing in front of you. And Oscar said to him, look, he said, I didn't come here to hear me. I came here to hear you.
Mm.
I said, wow.
Right. Ah.
I've told that story to a bunch of other people. I also credit
Oh,
you having told it to me because this way it's sharing a gift that you gave me
oh,
rather than stealing it. You know,
well, thank you. I'm so glad that touched you. Yeah, that was
yeah,
a
well, I'm
special
glad
one.
you told me that story because
Any,
that made me think of all the time I've gotten nervous playing. I said, oh man, there's somebody, all the people I know that play be under the table.
Mm,
But then it reinforced the fact that I should just go out there and do the best I can.
yeah, I guess that's all we can do. Well, I was just curious, is there anything in your life you regret having done or wish you had done? I mean,
Oh, sure.
I'm sure, yeah.
Oh, a lot of things. Well, that's the
Hmm.
reason when I was going to get a bar mitzvah, we had just moved from our farm to Washington, D.C., and the temple we wanted to belong to cost as much for the year as my father was making for that year. He took a tremendous cut, to put it mildly, just to
Mm,
work as a government lawyer. And my mother worked for something, uh, some little governmental organization. And
mm.
so I never got around to doing it. And then, so I got this. Now I joined the temple. So at 94, I'm having my bar mitzvah this June,
That is awesome. Wow.
only because I felt it was a hole. And I've written a Passover opera, The Final Ingredient, that was shown on network television. I was the music
Mm,
director for 17 years for the International Jewish Arts Festival. We conducted members of the Met Orchestra and works of Jewish
mm,
composers, and played jazz with tunes written by Jewish composers, and then played roots of Jewish music with the Middle Eastern group. And I did that every year for 17 years. It was really fun.
wow.
And I've written a sacred service for the Park Avenue Synagogue and been to
Mm,
so many Jewish community centers, done a lot of other stuff, but still, I didn't have a bar mitzvah. I said, man,
mm,
I felt like a phony, sort of,
mm.
in myself.
Right.
So, and the young rabbi in this little teeny temple Israel in Catskill is so soulful and so
Mm,
nice, and somehow manages to have a place that's full of love and everybody feels welcome.
mm.
They don't have a president or anything. They're just, but she's really steeped in and does almost the entire service in Hebrew because she studied
Mm,
Chabad, and sings the prayers. It's actually like being like being in an old time temple. It's amazing.
mm.
So so she's nice enough to do it instead of saying, "Well, you should have done that 60 years ago." She said, "No, we'll do it, man." And
Oh,
I feel really good about that. So that's one thing. My other
wow.
desire is, because I dedicated my first book to Dimitri Mitropoulos, to do a
Mm,
concert in Greece dedicated to him. But I think because of the difficult situations that symphony orchestras are having, that'll probably never happen.
mm,
I've had some near misses, but and if I don't, then I'll just mention them in my next book anyway. And those are the two things that I really felt that I wanted to do. Then, of
really.
course, I'd
Mhm.
like to have been able to continue the Jewish studies, but I never had the time, as I do living up here in the sticks now, to find
Mm,
a little temple that was where I could be part of that quietly, just as Joe Schmo, Mr. Anonymous.
mm,
It's funny because I explained to a wonderful guy who's a excellent recording engineer, has Old Soul Studios up here where I've done a lot of recording. He's a member of that temple. He said, "No, you'll love it, man." He said, it's really got that spirit.
mm,
And I said, well, I'm not coming there to make any connections, get a better gig, marry a millionaires. I just want to go someplace where I could pray and get to understand more of the heritage.
Mm.
He said, in other words, you're looking, you want to go someplace where you can be close to God. I said, wow. I never heard anybody say that before. And,
Wow.
and I feel very lucky that I've found that, you know,
Mm.
and I hope for the rest of my life that I can just inspire people coming up not to give up, not to
Mm.
understand all the negativity that's dumped upon us, but if they feel they were put here to do something, to figure out they're going to do that the rest of their lives, no
Mm.
matter what they have to do to pay their rent, and
Yeah.
regardless of the criticism. And if they
Mm.
so-called make it, so what?
Yes, to the doing.
So I encourage everybody, young person, I follow those career death wishes to the max.
Hmm. Well,
And
I mean,
because what you deserve and what you get in our society have nothing to do with one another.
mm,
And
oh.
they say, I forget which part of the Bible, by your works ye shall be known. And it's true.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that and all of this. I mean, I haven't, every time we talk, I leave just so uplifted and enthusiastic and inspired. And you're a great testament to everyone who should follow your heart and do what you love. And
That's it.
just thank you for being you and for this.